several years ago, most of you probably know Annie and Laura are sisters. Annie's about to have a baby. And they were up in Pennsylvania, and they made a huge sacrifice, relative comfort, relative stability to come down and join, us. But, Rod's wild brother-in-law with these crazy harebrained ideas to start this new church. And they committed all in to do that and have sacrificed a lot. Unfortunately, neither of them are in here to hear me say this, but we'll say it again as often as we can, that I'm so thankful. There's so much. You kind of see with this little gathering, and I don't know, I thought fall back, we'd have more, a lot of people are taking advantage of the opportunity to sleep in this morning. That's fine. Thank God for that, but they really have sacrificed a lot, and it's been a burden on their family, and so pray for them. Pray for them during this season as they have their fourth child. They live in an apartment, and just pray for them. Partner with them and with us. And then the other family is Bernard and Margaret. So Bernard went running out before he thought maybe I might say something. Margaret's here. But Bernard and Margaret and Laura and I have known each other for a long time, much longer than I've known Rod. We were in their wedding and been through the whole journey before they got married. And Bernard and Margaret also left a fairly comfortable, stable kind of ministry position over in Northern Virginia, Ambassador Bible Church, whom we love them, to, again, go on this wild, harebrained adventure with Ed and Laura and Rod and Annie as well. And they sacrificed a lot. And unlike Rod and I, Bernard has kind of a real job and works 9 to 5, and this is a really busy season for him. And I try to hold back. I'm trying to protect him, but he's all in with everything. So pray for Bernard and Margaret as they go through. It's a busy work. Some of y'all know what a busy work season is like, and sometimes you can scale back on other things. And, Bernard is taking a big load of the ministry here. And so I just, thank you to you and Bernard. It's a huge sacrifice, and it's a sacrifice that we all counted and we understand, and that kind of leads into this message, which is counting the cost. So big commitments. It was a big commitment for Rod and Annie to come down, and it was a big commitment for Margaret and Bernard. It was a big commitment for us, years in the making. But think about big commitments. Big commitments always cost a lot. So when I was a kid, we're kind of winding down football season. My heart is still a little broken because we lost our playoff game yesterday. So my coaching career is currently over with Elijah. We put him into the hands of Northwest High School starting next year. But as a kid playing football, I understood that my life's going to be different. I got to practice. Elijah and our three boys, from July until school starts, it's 5 nights a week for 2 hours plus Saturday. So it's a huge commitment. It's a commitment for parents. It's a commitment to pain. And we tell the boys who play football, football is not a contact sport. Dancing is a contact sport. You have contact when you're dancing. Like ballroom dancing, there's contact. Football is a collision sport. Big difference, okay? Big difference. And it hurts. And it's supposed to, if you watch college or NFL football, every play, there's guys that are smashing their bodies into one another, and it hurts. And we tell kids, look, if you don't like to smash into other people and hit and get hit, this is not for you, okay? So there's pain that's involved in money and all that kind of stuff. But then think about your career. There's a huge cost that you make to prepare for your career. You go to school, you pay money for your education, you put in all this time, and then once you kind of get into, even before you get into your career, you invest all this time in how to interview well, and it could cost you money even for coaching. And then once you get into a job, you have this professional advancement, and you spend a lot of time advancing your career. I know Margaret as a teacher, there's a lot that's involved in that. Bernard, many of you, right? You understand, you put a lot into your career, gaining experience and all that. And then even singleness. There's a cost to singleness. And I've just been recently reading the best thing I've ever read on both serving out of marriage and singleness. Singleness, on one hand, can be a choice to celibacy for a lifetime. I know 2 men who have made a lifelong choice. And listen, they're both good-looking guys. They could easily get married. I'm sure they get hit on a lot, but they've made a lifetime commitment to celibacy. That's a cost. They are not like anybody else that they're ever with. And there's a cost to that. For some people, it's a season of life. I mean, for some people, it's not a choice, but for some people, they're waiting for God's choice, and there's a cost. They're not going to be like the other people around them. One of my best friends didn't get married into his 30s, and all he ever we went to college together, one of my best friends all he ever talked about was girls, and how badly and desperately he wanted to get married, and this is a godly guy, and it was like over 10 years later that finally God brought somebody into his life. And of course, marriage costs a lot. For those of you who are single, it costs a lot. Going on dates costs a lot of money, And then when it goes really well and you're ready to take that next step, you got to get a ring, costs a lot of money. Talking on the phone. This is a thing that some of us we're pretty much all in the age where you remember talking on the phone. You'd actually call, and then when you had the dial, it was like you were hoping, I was hoping Laura would be in her dorm room. Like that was my only communication with Laura, and or writing letters. That used to be a thing. Laura, I have a box of letters that Laura wrote, to me back then. And I knew she took time, to write it. And I wasn't a very good letter writer, but but I'd put the time in. And it costs a lot. It took a lot of time to daydream. And then the loss of independence. That's a cost. When you get married, it's not me anymore, it's we. And that costs something, right? Well, when it comes to following Jesus, there is a cost associated with that decision. And Jesus made a clear statement, or several statements, when he talked in Luke 14 about counting the cost. This isn't our main text. We're getting into Nehemiah, but I just want to paint the picture of counting the cost. Here's what Jesus said. Whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Of course. For you lay the foundation and you're not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. They didn't count the cost. Or suppose a king is about to go out to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming at him with 20,000? Pretty wise to consider that, right? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. Hey, we don't want our 10,000 men to die. Is there any way we can make this right before we die? Of course, he's going to consider that. In the same way, Jesus said, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciple. So making a big commitment requires a person to make the consideration of to count the cost. Like there's a big cost. Whenever we make a big decision, there's a big cost. And God is calling us to join him. Even if you don't believe this, even if you're far away from this, what we believe is that God, if there's a God, if you don't believe in God, that God is bringing restoration, in which we see that as reconciliation, justice, beauty, and shalom, peace. And he's calling us to join him in that. That's a huge commitment. Well, God is calling us to join him in the restoration of all things, starting here in the lives and homes of real people right here in Gaithersburg, Maryland. I'm so excited to tell you that we were part of this thing called United in Action. We are part of it, and they did a conference Friday and Saturday night, and you were all invited, and some came. There's going to be another event on Saturday, December 9th. We'll share a little bit more about that in the next couple weeks. But it's basically this group of pastors, white, black, Hispanic, I don't know if that's the right term, but Spanish-speaking and Asian, to talk about race. Difficult conversations. Yesterday morning, we sat around 9 tables, all of us, all very diverse, kind of like us, and start sharing our stories of privilege and how we've experienced privilege. And in and through this movement, God is working powerfully. There were a lot of tearful moments. Friday night, in the prayer time, Inping and Pastor Rod and I, we were sitting together and we had this prayer time, and we turned around this lady. I don't know how old she was, 65 maybe, I don't know, maybe older, I don't know. But she talked about how she grew up in Montgomery County, and she told us her story of being bused to segregated school, driving past multiple segregated schools to go to her segregated school. And it's interesting that Gaithersburg, do you know the number one, the country of origin for the majority of people in Gaithersburg? It's not even, I would be very ignorant to say Africa is a country. Of course not. The countries of Africa is where the majority of people have their heritage in Gaithersburg. Pretty interesting. And yet, there's a massive problem of inequality in our city. And we got to talk about that. And so here's why I share all that. Because in and through that, God is bringing restoration and reconciliation and peace and justice. And I mean, there's some godly people. I mean, Enping and I sat at a table yesterday with Pastor Pumphrey. And just a man of God. I'm just unworthy to sit at the table with him. His son was sitting at the table as well. And their pastor, one of their pastors, Tony Cyrus, is coming to share next Sunday. So bring all your friends next Sunday. I told him, and Tony's become a good friend of mine. I told him, I said, Tony, you're going to be the first black preacher at Restoration Church. So dude, you got to bring it, brother. Like you're setting the bar for black preaching in our church. And look, I mean, we need it to be really high. So please come, invite your friends. We're not even sure totally on the top. I said, Tony, just come and share your heart, man. Just make it Jesus, Bible, whatever you want to talk about. And then we'll transition to Advent. Then, hopefully, Lord willing, December 31st, Roddy, one of the other pastors who's planting right in right in Germantown. Literally, I could walk from my house to his neighborhood where he's planting. I didn't realize it until yesterday. It's like, oh, this is awesome. And we're going to be partnering. And Roddy came out of that same church and is planting. And hopefully he's going to come share with us on December 31st. So back-to-back months with some black preachers up in Restoration Church. What's up? You know God is bringing some restoration in this place. And he's calling us to join him. So here's the thing. Everything isn't okay. Like everything isn't just fine. Everything probably isn't just fine in your house. There's probably some issues, just like, in me. Everything in your neighborhood isn't just fine. And I recently heard someone say, and I love this, I don't know if it's going to become a thing here at Restoration Church, but that fine is the Christian F word. You know, like, hey, how you doing, Marcy? Oh, fine. Don't lie, girl. Everything ain't fine. I just looked at Marcy. I didn't mean that. Yeah. Marcy would let me know. Yeah, because everything isn't all fine. And that's the reality. Not that, sometimes life is great and we're filled with joy and it's great, and it's better than fine. And I believe everyone here wants to see that happen, wants to see God bringing reconciliation, justice, beauty, and wholeness. But to see that happen, we've got to count the cost and to continue counting the cost for our city and for God's glory. So that's what's going to lead us into Nehemiah. The story of Nehemiah is about a man who counted the cost of following God's call and how then the people responded to his leadership. God and the restoration he is bringing to us, our community and beyond, is what should be important to us, because we're not just here to set up a service every week. We're not just here to feel good. We're setting this up. I hope you sing and worship, and I hope it all feel good, but that's not what it's all about. It's about real restoration, the needs of people that are really hurting. There's a real mission God is calling us to, but it comes with a cost. Right now, one of the things that we need is someone to lead our kids ministry. Like if we're going to see families come, and we have some plans for what we're going to be doing in the winter and starting in January. But would you just join me in praying for someone that can lead our kids ministry? Like we need somebody to do that. Rod is leading in there right now. God help him, like mercy on Pastor Rod right now, okay? The person who's supposed to be here didn't work out, couldn't show up. What are we going to do? Pastor Rod's in there, that's fine. And the people that have been helping out are fabulous. And many of you are those people that are helping. It's fabulous. We just need some more help so that really we can provide a gospel-centered opportunity for kids to join God in the restoration of all things too, and so that parents can come and not worry about what's going on behind that wall. Pastor Rod didn't seem to know what he was doing. I think I'm going to trust what's going on in there, All right, so let's get back to Nehemiah, walk through the story, and respond as God speaks to us. So we're at a place in the story where the wall has been restored, the wall's up. Before the wall was up, the temple had already been rebuilt, and there was already worship, but the city was in ruins. Now that's changed. The people have returned to God's truth. Pastor Bernard talked about that 2 weeks ago. They've confessed their sin, and they're now in a place where they're ready for their way of life to be restored. We're at this climactic point in the story of Nehemiah, which is super exciting. So that leads us to Nehemiah 10. Okay? So Nehemiah 10. Now, if you have your Bible and you want to open it there, we're not going to go through the first 27 verses which starts with Zedekiah, Sariah, Azariah, Jeremiah, Pashur, Amariah, Malchijah, and that goes on for 27 verses. So there's all the people, okay, so just set the stage. Those first 27 verses, these are the signers of the commitment that they're making. So chapter 10 is about this counting the cost commitment that they're making. So we want to look at this commitment. The commitment involves the leaders and heads of the families who followed Nehemiah and Ezra's leadership, not only to rebuild the wall, but the city, and to restructure their way of life. So these are, it starts with the heads of their family and the leaders and the Levites, and they're signing this covenant. The story is all about the people of God who recenter their ways around God's ways. They didn't just show up at the temple on Saturday. That wasn't the goal. The goal wasn't to have like a protective wall so they could just show up to the temple and then go back to the way life was. The whole goal of this whole book and the whole goal of life is a restructuring so that it's no longer a me-centered way of life, it's a Jesus-centered way of life. That's what God's people do. God's people don't just show up. All right, verse 28. Chapter 10, verse 28. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who separated themselves from the neighboring peoples for the sake of the law of God, together with their wives and all their sons and daughters who are able to understand. They join with their brothers, the nobles, and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God given through Moses, the servant of God, to obey carefully all the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord our God. They were making a commitment to restructure and recenter their whole way of life around the ways of God. Now he says in verse 29, the curse and the oath. It says, and bind themselves with a curse and an oath to follow the law of God. Now, I don't know about you, but you probably didn't show up this morning wanting to commit to a curse. I want to explain this. This expression really means an oath with penalties. When Jesus said, you cannot be my disciple unless the penalty is you can't be mine unless you give it all. And so this is coming out of the whole idea through the whole Old Testament, which was God's way. Like there's a penalty. Now, I want you to hear the penalty. So the idea here is that they were submitting themselves to the curse or penalty that God promised would come on those who didn't keep His word. So this is from Deuteronomy. I'll just read a few verses to you. 15 to 20 says this, however, if you do not obey the law of your God and do not carefully follow all His commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Yikes. Verse 16, this is Deuteronomy 28. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. Your basket and your kneading, your bread ain't going to be very good. Verse 17. Verse 18, the fruit of your womb will be cursed, and the crops of your land, and the calves of your herd, and the lambs of your flock. You will be cursed when you come in, and cursed when you go out. The Lord will send on you a curse, confusion, and rebuke in everything you put to your hand to, until you are destroyed and come to sudden ruin because of the evil you have done in forsaking Him. He goes on, we're going to read the last few verses, because I want us to feel the weight of this. Verse 64, then the Lord will scatter you among all nations. Now, if you think about where the Jews are today, where are they? They haven't come back. They haven't come back yet. So, this is like there's a real consequence, right? Even when you think of the first century, the Jews that were in, Jerusalem there, that wasn't, they were scattered at that point all over. They hadn't come back yet from exile. And they're not back. There you will worship other gods, gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known. Among those nations you will find no repose, no resting place for the sole of your foot. There the Lord will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart. You will live in constant suspense, filled with dread both day and night, never sure of your life. In the morning you will say, if only it were evening. And in the evening, if only it were morning. Because of the terror that will fill your hearts and the sights that your eyes will see. The Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt on a journey I said you should never make again. I mean, the Lord laid it out and you were set free out of Egypt, never to go back, and yet He's saying, well, no, you might. And essentially they did, kind of metaphorically. They didn't go back to Egypt, but there you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. Man, this is the God who loves His creation. Yes, this is the God who gave His life for you. I mean, we're going to share that Christmas Eve. John 3:16 is the message for Christmas Eve. God gave, like we give because God gave. So the people were recommitting themselves. Okay, God, we know you could take us away again. Think about who these people were. They had been taken out of their country and enslaved. And because of the goodness of God, and through Nehemiah, through Ezra and Zerubbabel and then Nehemiah, they reestablish a place of worship. And God in His mercy allows us to come back and they say, God, we are committing ourselves to a curse if we don't keep this commitment to you. There are 6 specific commitments that the people make. And we'll go through them quickly and then we'll consider what it means to us. So back to Nehemiah 10, there are 6 commitments. The first one is to purity in verse 30. We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us or take their daughters for our sons. I mean, God help us for thinking about this in terms of ethnicity. I was just reading something that broke my heart. Pastor Derwin Gray has been a mentor of mine, and I consider him a hero in the church right now. Black pastor down in South Carolina. I've had a chance to be with him personally a number of times. Bernard, Rod, and I interviewed him back in September. And I don't think we even have that up yet, but it's fabulous. We'll make it available as soon as we can. I'm talking about race and things like that. And but there are unfortunately leaders in our history, in America's history, who would use this to say, well, whites ought not to marry blacks or Asians or whatever. And really, in some cultures, that's still very strong. As a matter of fact, Laura and I are going to be part of a wedding next week. Both families who are Christians and love the Lord. And it took about, 2 years for the Korean person in the family, their side of the family, to be okay with their daughter marrying a Chinese. I mean, they're still Asian, I mean, it wasn't even that big of a difference, but it was so ingrained in the culture that even now, I mean, that's a thing. Not to intermarry with people who worship other gods. Okay, so let's just be clear. This has nothing to do with ethnicity. This has to do with people who are worshiping another god. And I would just tell you, if you got a daughter, you better teach her not to go run around with boys who are worshiping other gods. And teach your boys not to go after girls who ain't worshiping the Lord. I mean, we see that clearly in 1 Corinthians 6 and 7. Repeated by the Apostle Paul. The second commitment in verse 31 is to recreation and the Sabbath. So the first is purity. Verse 32, we assume the responsibility, verse 31. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them. We are Chick-fil-A. We will not buy for them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. I mean, this has got to be the motto of Chick-fil-A right here. Can you believe the Atlanta Falcons' new stadium has a Chick-fil-A in it? And it's closed on Sundays. They have one Monday night game, and it's open on that one day. That's a real story, like for real. Unbelievable. But they're committed to this, right? Every 7th year, we will forgo working the land and will cancel all debts. So it was keeping the Sabbath day and the sabbatical year, which is every 7 years, to let the land just go. And that took a big amount of trust in God It was a counting the cost to follow the ways of God. This is the core commandment of the 10. You may not have thought about this, but out of all 10 commandments, keeping the Sabbath was the core commandment. And I don't know if you've dwelt on this before, but this dealt directly with the people's relationship with God and their worship of God. And do you know the consequence? If you were like, man, I didn't get a whole lot done last week, man. I gotta do something with these trees in the backyard. And you were caught out trimming your tree, death was the consequence. I mean, this is serious. Like, keeping the Sabbath was a hardcore. Why? Because God said, look, I worked to create the world and the universe and the gazillion billion stars, just, so you could see a little bit of my glory. And I took the seventh day off, and this is for you to understand that you're not God and I'm God. And so that's part of the whole Sabbath. Like, you're not God. And I struggle with this because sometimes I'm like, no, I got to get this done. I got to make this happen. I got to come up with something. I got to work a little bit harder. And, that's plagues most of us, right? So this commitment to purity, the commitment to recreate, which is one of our rhythms as well. And then the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth all have to do with giving generously, which is one of our core values. Verse 32 and 33, this is the third one. We assume the responsibility for carrying out the commands to give a third of a shekel each year for the service of the house and the burnt offerings, for the offerings on the Sabbaths, new moons, festivals, and appointed feasts, for the holy offerings, for sin offerings, to make atonement for Israel, and for all the duties of the house of our God. We're going to give toward that. We're going to give toward that. Secondly, look at verse 34. We, the priests, the Levites, and the people, we have cast lots to determine which of our families is to bring to the house of our God at set times of each year a contribution of the wood to burn on the altar. So next week we're going to have a basket over here for you to bring some wood so that we can have some fires and heat up our home. No, we're not. I don't know what that would look like in our circumstance, but it was that practical. So we're going to give toward to the priests so that they can do their thing, and we're going to give wood so that they can do the offering. That was really important. And how much wood is in Israel? Like, this is precious commodity. You don't get wood from Israel. Like, it's stone. It's a desert. There are forests, on the outskirts or whatever, but in and around Jerusalem, like, there's not a whole lot of trees. So, that's it's a big deal. It's a sacrifice. They counted the cost. And then verse 35, the third way that they were giving, we also assume the responsibility for giving to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree. It is also written in the law that we will bring the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle and of our herd and of our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests ministering there. Moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priests, the first of our ground meal, of our grain offerings, the fruit of our trees, and of our new wine and oil. And so, they were really contributing to the needs of the worship. The worshiping community, and the fact that their lives were centered around worship. And then he goes on, the fourth way, he says, and we will bring a tithe. So he didn't start with a tithe, he started with all these other things. They're given way over just a tithe, but finally he says, and we will bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where we work. A priest descendant from Aaron is to accompany the Levites, and when they receive the tithes, and the Levites are to bring a tenth of the tithes. So they tithe, and then the Levites are to bring a tenth of the tithe to provide for their meals. He says, the people of Israel then, including the Levites, are to bring their contributions of grain, new wine, and oil to the storerooms where the articles of the sanctuary are kept, and where the ministering priests and the gatekeepers and the singers stay. So, this is really practical, like they're taking care of the people who are serving. And I started today by my meager attempt to say thank you and to do all I can in the months to come to say thank you. And those who serve and volunteer in the ministry here that make it happen, thank you, because we can't do it without everybody doing their part. And we say here that when everybody plays, everybody wins. It's not a game that we're playing, but we play on the team together. Verse 39 summarizes the latter four commitments, which all have to do with giving out of and for the sake of worship. Their primary focus and concern was to restore worship of God at the center of their way of life. They were saying, God, I love you. I love you. And I'm going to do this because I love you. The last part of verse 39, we will not neglect the house of our God. Now, it wasn't that God was so interested in his physical house. What concerned him was that his people lovingly obeyed him in response to who he is and what he had done for them and on their behalf. Because if the people responded in loving obedience, then they could be a light to the nations, which was his intent from the very beginning. We see that all the way back to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. You're going to be a light to all nations. And we believe that with such great commitment here. And, Laura and I were giving our lives to go to the nations. Jean went to the nations. She's out at the nations. And Karen's going to go. It's, debatable, U.S., Puerto Rico, but across the water. And but we're living in a place where the nations literally come to us. It's amazing. It's incredible. God doesn't have a physical house anymore. That physical house was only ever meant to point forward to what he would do in and through his son, Jesus. As committed as we can ever be to God and his mission, we are going to fail. This week, I'm going to fail. Today, I'm going to fail. We're going to fail. We're going to all fall short of perfection. But Jesus, he alone fulfilled all of God's commandments perfectly. He was able to do it. The people who said, we're going to commit everything to you, they couldn't do it. They were all in. They counted the cost. They understood, but they couldn't do it. And neither ultimately can we. He gave his perfect life for all of us, for Jews and Gentiles, from all peoples, from all nations, from everywhere, from every place of, quote, lostness as well. Some of us grew up in a good home, but we didn't have a relationship with Jesus. Some of us grew up in a broken home doing drugs and running with thugs. He died for all people from all backgrounds, from all places of brokenness. Even rich folks. He died for you too. Democrats. He died for Democrats. He died for Republicans. He died for Hillary Clinton and Bill and Donald Trump and his whole family. He died for all of us everywhere in between. All of that in our place, taking our guilt and our shame and the penalty that we deserved. And he took all that on his body, nailing them to the cross. And then he rose from the dead to prove that he alone could take all of that and had the power over sin and death. He defeated the ultimate enemy, which is death. Hallelujah. Amen? Now look, Pastor Tony comes up in here next week. We're going to need a stronger amen than that. He might be all up in here, I don't know. I've never heard Tony preach, Now don't be scared, okay? Tony, you're going to love Tony. Now from that day forward, after Jesus did what only he could do, in our place, from that day forward, God would have no temple again here on earth. The veil was torn when Jesus said, "It is finished." There was an earthquake. And from that day forward, the veil was torn in the temple. Even though they tried to sew it back together for a few more years, it was done with, it was over. And by 70 AD, it was crumbled into a pile of rocks. And if you go there today, there's only the Temple Mount. There's no temple there anymore. Then what God did is he sent his Spirit not to dwell in a building or in a place, but to dwell in his people who trust him. And then we, his people, his family, become the temple. We become the temple. The church is not a building or an event or a meeting. The church is the people, the family of God, where his Spirit dwells now. He now indwells the temple, which is us. Now, I strongly believe that there is something different when we come together corporately and we worship. There is something that is important and special about God's presence when we gather, certainly, but it's not like we need to pray, God, that your presence would come. His presence is here. We need to be aware. The more aware we are of the fact that we are his temple and he is dwelling in us, the more we'll be in awe of his holiness when we come together. And I believe that God speaks and moves in special ways in that context. So now, just like in the times of Nehemiah, our primary focus and concern should be restoring worship to the center of our way of life. Meeting together like this for worship service is important, right? But everything we do is worship. And Bernard, if he was here, he would have just said, amen. He's our, quote, worship leader. I don't think he even likes that, but he's kind of the first worshiper. I don't know if that's what he would say, but, he's the leading worshiper. Okay, there is something that's important to us, but everything we do is worship. In everything that we do, we ascribe and give worth to things. And sometimes we elevate people and relationships and money and things above God's place. And that's where it becomes an idol. And in essence, we're worshiping that. We don't think about it that way. I'll never forget Laura and I being in China with a group of teens, and we were in this Buddhist temple. And it was the first time I ever tangibly saw somebody bow down and worship to an idol. And we were here, that's kind of like a history lesson kind of thing. And this lady comes right up through our group. This huge Buddha that was, 3 stories high. And she came, we all just kind of sat back watching this lady worship this Buddha. It was, wow. And we don't see that a whole lot, but it's happening every day all around us and sometimes in us. But the great news this morning is that wherever we're coming from, like whether you've been walking closely with Jesus or you've been out with the wrong folks or been making the wrong decisions, or maybe it's just in your own heart, wherever you are, however close or far from God is. Maybe you've been having a week or a month or a year of failure in following. You don't have to take that oath for the curse, because Jesus was the curse for us. That's not the commitment we're here. We have to count the cost, but there's no oath to the curse because he took it for us. He's ready to restore us this morning, but it's not cheap. It requires us to count the cost. So are we willing to commit to a way of life that no longer centers around us? It's not a one and done kind of thing. It's a commitment that we're making regularly. So there are folks that are in here from many different backgrounds, including some who are already, most of us are followers of Jesus already. We made that commitment, okay? I think I know just about all of you pretty well. Some of you might be more curious seekers, skeptics, everything in between, but that's the message that we want to give here at Restoration Church. We want skeptics and those who are curious seekers to be part of what we're doing and to belong because they belong where God is moving, because he's bringing restoration where? Into the lives of people who are curious skeptics and so on and so forth, right? That's who we're trying to bring this message of restoration to. So for those of us who are not yet following Jesus, here's the bottom line. Jesus loves you beyond what you can possibly imagine. We're going to be talking about that in a very tangible way through the Christmas season. If maybe I don't know you that well, just come talk to me afterwards and we can have a conversation. Come have dinner with us next week and we'll talk about how to have this relationship with Jesus in a growing way. But for those of us who are already followers of Jesus, the question is this: how is God calling you to count the cost? You've got this little card. Is it a card? I don't know. Man, I always forget to buy different colored paper. I'm so boring. If you're into that kind of thing, please put on your connection card. I want to help, with these things, and I'd love to have your help. But this is just a simple way for us to respond in a very tangible way. So we have this simple card to use in response, and we're going to wrap it up, and then we're going to celebrate and take communion together. So at the top of it, it's I'm counting the cost for our city by doing a couple things. And I really want to center in on the giving piece, but these other pieces are really important too. So the first commitment that the people of God in Nehemiah's story made was not to intermarry, but to have purity in relationships. And I just think that if we're struggling in this area, we can't make it alone. So that's why the number one thing here I put is participating in a community group. If relationships is a struggle, and especially if you feel more alone. So, I don't know that any of us are struggling with your daughters intermarrying with pagans. I don't know. Maybe that is a thing for your family. Come help us. Or come to us. We'll talk. We'll pray. We'll intervene. We'll do whatever we can, to help that. But I think the point is that if we're going to make this first commitment towards purity, it's so important that we do that together in community. Now, our community groups are coming to a wrap-up starting in 2 weeks. And then we'll just hit the pause button, Thanksgiving to Christmas, and we'll do things like take turkeys to families and serve serve and have appreciation, gatherings and Christmas parties. And we want you to be not busy with a bunch of church stuff so that you can be out blessing folks. So that's why we hit the pause button. People be traveling, that type of thing. I'll be traveling down in Florida, my wife and I, Christmas Eve service. We'll be in a hurry to wrap things up because we're going to get into a rental van and drive to Florida all day. I told the kids we're on the way over here. I said, y'all excited about going to Florida? What are you talking about? Hey, you want to know what Daddy's excited about? We're going to drive all night. My sons are like, pulling their hair out. The second commitment is to recreating, okay? And this is one where you just may need to take some time. We've got what's called the Way of Life plan that goes through this in much greater detail, but we just want you to think about, hey, during this season, this could be hard. Do you need to rest a little bit? Do you need a little more sleep? Do you need to, eat a few more bananas? We got some in the back. Whatever it might be, we take that seriously. We want you to think through. The people of God in Nehemiah's story committed themselves to the Sabbath. Recreating is a way of making the same commitment. Okay, it's not that we're making a day, the Sabbath. We don't call it that. We call it recreating, but it's that same principle. And it's a way to demonstrate that our relationship with Him is the main priority and that we trust Him. So there are three ways: physical, emotional, and spiritual recreating. And I don't have time now to dive too much into that, but in our community groups and in the Way of Life plan, we're going to dive a lot more into that. So we want to encourage you to think about that. But really, what I want you to think about in this holiday season is giving. And now we're not just talking about finances, but the main way that the people of God in Nehemiah's story counted the cost for their city was generous giving. And this was the core value out of our four that we felt like, this is something we're aspiring to. We're not there yet as pastors, leaders, as men, families, whatever, but we want to aspire to that. We want Restoration Church to be known as a generous church. And so one of the ways we do is, we give to the school. We give our time, we give our talents, we give our treasures to causes that help and bless people and bless neighborhoods. And so, the people, they supported the temple service financially. They contributed wood for the fire on the altar for burnt offerings. They gave of their first fruits of the crops to God, and they paid their annual tithes. That was the four ways that they committed to give generously. And we apply this in three ways I already mentioned. We give our time to serve. And so as we take this break from Thanksgiving through the new year, we want to encourage you to give some time to a cause. Help a family, help a neighbor. Get involved. Don't just make the holiday about the things we typically love about the holiday, but give of your time. Give of your talents. That goes right along with that. What are you really good at? How can you contribute? And how can you give those things, quite frankly and bluntly, to Restoration Church if you're not? If you are, we're going to throw a party and celebrate. But if you're not, we can use some help, especially with the kids. And in a few minutes, we're going to have our first drum lesson, actually, with Karen. And so, but you feel free to call. If any of you, you've had a lifelong dream of playing the drums, come meet Karen and I afterwards. But Bernard, I'm sure, would say amen to, hey, music, singers, if you have any skill whatsoever, talk to Bernard and give your time and talents in that way and your treasures. And we're going to have some specific challenges as we go through Advent. The first sermon is going to be spend less. How can you spend less in December? And then how can you give more? Yes, maybe in part to Restoration Church, but maybe to other causes and needs in our neighborhood and community. So how is God calling you to give, especially in light of the fast approaching holiday season? Let's prepare for what's ahead by counting the cost for our city. So prayerfully fill out your and in at least one or two areas, and then here's the idea. You can just put one thing that you're committing to. You don't have to, it's not like the whole plan, you're going to do this in the next 5 weeks, but maybe one thing, put the date, maybe you do this in the next week. Take it home, pray over it, think through it, and then have somebody sign it. Have somebody sign it. This isn't for me. Have somebody sign it, and then what we want you to do is take that next step and share it either in your community group. So if you're already part of a community group, in the next 2 weeks, share this in your community group. Hey, this is my commitment, guys. Would you pray for me? Let's pray for each other. Let's keep it real about where we're trying to grow. If you're not part of a community group or you don't make it or whatever, just share it with a friend. Share it with somebody. Share it with your spouse, your neighbor. Hey, this is an area during this season that I really want to count the cost of following Jesus, and I want you to know, and I need your prayers for that. And let's do it together.